The snow outside my kitchen window had been falling since early afternoon, and I was on my third cup of tea when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer it. It was 11:40 at night, and I didn't recognize the number. I'm 68 years old. I go to bed at 10 on most nights. I had my reading glasses on, a half-finished crossword puzzle on the table in front of me, and absolutely no interest in whatever someone wanted to sell me at that hour. But something made me pick up. Mr. Aldridge. The voice on the other end was young. A man, maybe late 20s, early 30s, a little nervous. My name is Noel. I'm a client advisor at your branch, the one on Baseline Road. I'm sorry to call so late. I know this is unusual. I told him it was more than unusual. Sir, I need you to listen to me carefully, because I'm not sure I have much time. There was an attempt earlier this evening to initiate a wire transfer from your checking account, a large one. The transfer was flagged by our system, which is why it didn't go through, but the request came in with all the right credentials, and the person who submitted it knew details about your account that they shouldn't have known unless... He paused. Sir, are you planning to travel tomorrow? I set down my crossword puzzle. I was, in fact, planning to travel the next morning. My son, my eldest, had organized the trip to Tofino for the long weekend. He said I needed to get away. He said the ocean air would do me good. He'd booked the flights, booked the lodge, arranged everything. I just needed to show up at the Ottawa airport by 9 a.m. Why? I asked Noel. Because whoever submitted this transfer request knew about the trip. It was mentioned in the notes they left. And, sir, another pause, longer this time. The amount they tried to move was $240,000. That's nearly everything in your checking account. I didn't say anything for a moment. I'm not a man who panics easily. I spent 31 years as a high school principal in Ottawa. I have broken up fights, delivered eulogies, sat across from grieving parents. I know how to stay calm when my hands want to shake, but my hands were shaking. Who submitted the request? I asked. That's the part I need to talk to you about in person, Noel said. Can you come in tomorrow morning? First thing, before 9. I asked him again, directly. I told him I was a grown man, and I needed to know what was happening with my own money. It was quiet for a long moment. The access came through your joint power of attorney, he said finally. The one on file for your son. I want to be honest about something. In the hours after that phone call, I did not immediately believe my son had done anything wrong. That's not how it works when it's your own child. You don't flip a switch. You don't suddenly see them differently. What you do is search desperately for every possible alternative explanation. Maybe there was a mistake in the system. Maybe someone had accessed the power of attorney fraudulently. Maybe my son had tried to move money for a legitimate reason and forgotten to tell me. My son is 51 years old. He's a project manager at a civil engineering firm. He coaches his daughter's soccer team on weekends. He is not a criminal. That's what I kept telling myself while I sat at my kitchen table in the dark, unable to sleep, unable to think straight, listening to the snow tap against the window. I had given my son power of attorney 3 years ago, after I had a minor cardiac episode. Nothing serious, a warning shot, the cardiologist called it, and my daughter-in-law had suggested it might give everyone peace of mind to have something on paper, just in case. I thought it was a reasonable idea. I still had full control of my own affairs. The POA was only to be used if I became incapacitated. I had not become incapacitated. I went to the bank at 7:30 the next morning. Noel was already there. He was younger than I'd expected. Dark hair, wire-rimmed glasses. The kind of careful, deliberate manner you see in people who are good at their jobs and know it. He shook my hand and brought me into a private office and closed the door. He spread several documents on the desk in front of me. The transfer request had come in at 8:17 the previous evening through the bank's online advisory portal. It had been submitted using my son's login credentials and authenticated with his registered phone number. The transfer was destined for an account I didn't recognize, a numbered company registered in Alberta. The memo line read, "Property transaction. R.A. pre-authorized. My initials are R.A. Richard Aldridge." But I had authorized nothing. "There's more," Noel said. He hesitated. "This isn't the first attempt. There was a smaller test transfer 2 weeks ago. $40. It went through. To the same destination account." I stared at him. "We flagged the large transfer because of the amount and the unusual timing," he said. "But the $40, that's a standard technique. Someone tests the channel first to make sure it works. Then they move the real amount." I asked him how long he had known about this. He said he'd noticed the pattern that afternoon while reviewing flagged transactions as part of his regular end-of-day work. He wasn't supposed to call clients after hours. He'd done it anyway because the travel notation in the file had concerned him. "I have a grandfather," he said simply. "He's about your age." I did not get on the plane to Defino. I called my son at 8 a.m. and told him I wasn't feeling well. He sounded concerned, maybe genuinely I couldn't tell anymore, and said we could reschedule. He said to rest. He said he'd check in on me later. I sat in my living room for a long time after that call, looking at the framed photograph on the mantel of the two of us at his university graduation. He had his arm around my shoulder. I was grinning like I'd won something. My wife, Paulette, had taken that photograph. She died 6 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks between diagnosis and the end. My son was there at the hospital. He held my hand in the hallway when the doctor came out to tell us. I have never forgotten that. I still can't fully reconcile the man in that photograph with what I was about to learn. I called a lawyer that morning, an estate and family law solicitor I had worked with when Paulette died, a woman named Janet, sharp and no-nonsense, who had always given me straight answers. I told her what the bank had found. She told me to come in that afternoon and not to discuss the matter with my son until we knew more. Over the next 5 days, with the help of Janet and a forensic accountant she brought in, the picture came together slowly, and it was worse than I had feared. The power of attorney my son held had been quietly, methodically used over the previous 14 months. Not just the attempted wire transfer. That was the largest and most obvious move, the one that finally tripped the bank's fraud detection. Before that, there had been a series of smaller maneuvers. A $12,000 withdrawal framed as a home renovation loan repayment. I had never taken such a loan. A $9,500 transfer to a joint account my son held with his wife, marked as a gift I had supposedly authorized, charges to a credit card linked to my account that I hadn't touched in 2 years. In total, just over $68,000 had moved out of my estate without my knowledge. When Janet laid it all out in a single document, I had to read it 3 times, not because I didn't understand it, but because I kept hoping that if I read it again, some of the numbers would change. They didn't. The hardest part was not the money. I want to be clear about that. I'm comfortable, not wealthy by any grand measure, but a teacher's pension and a paid-off house on a quiet street in the West End of Ottawa put me in a position that most people would not complain about. $68,000 is real money, but it was not going to change my life. What was going to change my life was the understanding that my son had looked at me, his father, a man who had raised him, coached his hockey team, driven him to university in a borrowed pickup truck with his mattress strapped to the roof, and seen a resource. Not a person, a resource. Not a person, a resource. I found out later, through the legal process, what had driven it. My son and his wife had been in serious financial trouble for almost 2 years. A failed investment in a commercial property in Gatineau, a line of credit that had ballooned, school fees for my grandchildren that they'd been quietly borrowing against. They had told no one. Not me, not her parents, not their financial advisor. They had just started quietly helping themselves to what they must have assumed would be theirs eventually anyway. That last part is what I think about sometimes, late at night. The assumption that my dying was inevitable enough, and close enough on the horizon, that the waiting had become inconvenient. I was 68 years old. I had just had my annual physical. My doctor had told me I was in good health for my age. I was taking a blood pressure medication, same as half the men I knew. I walked 40 minutes every morning along the river. I was not a man standing in the doorway. But to my son, apparently, I was. The RCMP became involved in the third week. It was Janet who insisted on it, over my initial reluctance. I had wanted to handle it quietly. Family matter, private resolution, that sort of thing. Janet sat across from me and said, very calmly, that what had happened was not a family matter. It was fraud, and if I declined to report it, there was a reasonable chance my son would do it again, to me or to someone else. She was right. I knew she was right. I just needed someone to say it plainly. The investigation took several months. My son denied everything at first, then claimed he had understood the transfers to be authorized. Then, when the forensic evidence made that position untenable, his lawyer approached Janet about a resolution. My daughter-in-law cooperated with investigators. I suspect she had wanted out of the situation for some time and saw the investigation as, perversely, an exit. My son was charged with fraud over $5,000 and breach of fiduciary duty. He pleaded guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence. He received a conditional sentence of 20 months to be served in the community, a restitution order for the full $68,000, and a permanent prohibition from holding power of attorney over any person. He did not go to prison. I have mixed feelings about that. Some days I think he should have. Most days I just feel tired. I want to tell you about Noel, because I think about him more than he probably knows. After the bank's internal review concluded, I learned that Noel had, technically speaking, violated protocol by calling me after hours. The bank's fraud team was supposed to handle client contact in situations like that. He had made a judgment call, a personal one, based on his own conscience, and it had cost him a formal reprimand that went into his file. When I found out, I went back to the branch to speak to his manager. I sat down with the branch manager, a careful woman who listened to me with the politely neutral expression that managers perfect over years of dealing with the public, and I told her that the reprimand was unjust, and that in my professional opinion, 31 years in education, including many years of evaluating staff, Noel had demonstrated exactly the kind of character and judgment that institutions should be rewarding, not penalizing. She said she appreciated my perspective. I also wrote a letter to the bank's regional ombudsman. I don't know if it made a difference. What I do know is that 6 months after all of this, Noel was promoted to a senior client advisory role. I'd like to think the letter helped. I also know that I set aside a registered education contribution for his daughter. He had mentioned her once, briefly, in a way that told me he was a man who thought about the future. It wasn't a large amount. It wasn't meant to be payment for what he did. It was meant to say, I see you. I know what it cost you to make that phone call. And I didn't forget. I brought it to him in an envelope at the branch, which I realize is not the most sophisticated financial vehicle. And he looked at it for a long moment, and then looked at me and said he couldn't accept it. I told him it wasn't for him. It was for his daughter. There's a difference. He laughed a little. He took the envelope. There are things I am still working through. I have not spoken to my son since Sing Sing. He has written me 2 letters which I have read and not answered. I don't know if I will. My grandchildren, his kids, my granddaughter who is 12, and my grandson who is 9, are caught in the middle of something that is entirely the fault of their parents and entirely unfair to them. I have been in contact with my daughter-in-law about maintaining a relationship with them. That conversation was difficult. I think we will find a way. I still live in the same house. I still walk along the river in the mornings. The pathway is icy in winter, and there is one particular section near the Carlton footbridge where you have to watch your step. And I always think, when I'm careful on that ice, that caution is something you develop over time. You don't learn it once. You keep learning it. My wife would have known what to do. She was always better at the human parts of things than I was. She would have sat down with my son years ago, before any of this, and she would have asked him, in that direct way she had, that somehow never felt like an accusation, how he was really doing, and he might have told her, and maybe none of it would have happened. But Paulette is gone, and I am still here, which is more than I would have been able to say if I had gotten on that plane to Tofino. I think about that sometimes. The version of this story where I dismissed the late-night phone call as a scam. Where I set my glasses on the nightstand and go to sleep and wake up and pack my bag and drive to the airport. Where I land on the West Coast in the rain, walk into that lodge my son had booked, and sit down to dinner with the man who had been quietly dismantling my life for 14 months. I think about how I would have smiled across the table at him and had no idea. It is a strange thing to owe your life, or at least your financial security, your legal standing, your ability to remain in your own home, to a young man at a bank branch who stayed late on a Thursday evening, noticed a pattern in the numbers that crossed his desk, and decided, against the rules, that the right thing to do was pick up a phone. Most people would not have done that. Most people would have filed the report, passed it to the fraud department, and gone home to their families. Nobody would have blamed them. It was not their job to save a 68-year-old retired principal from his own son. Noel did it anyway. I don't have a tidy lesson to wrap around what happened to me. I'm not going to tell you to review your legal documents, though you should. I'm not going to tell you to be suspicious of the people who love you, because I don't believe that's a good way to live. What I will tell you is that the people who change the course of your life rarely announce themselves. They show up at 11:40 at night, uncertain, apologetic, breaking the rules in small ways for reasons that have nothing to do with reward. Pay attention to those people, and when you can, tell them that you did. I've had a lot of time to think about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in any grand spiritual sense. I'm not a man who reaches for that kind of framework easily, but as someone who spent 3 decades watching young people grow into who they were going to become, I believe deeply that the choices we make in private eventually find their way into the open. Every time. My son didn't become someone who could do this overnight. That's the part that took me longest to sit with. The decisions that led him here were made quietly, over months and years. A small dishonesty here, a rationalization there, the slow convincing of himself that what he was doing was temporary, or justified, or somehow owed to him. That's how it always works. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to betray someone they love. They arrive there by degrees, and each degree feels small enough to step over. I think about Noel in the same way. He didn't become someone who would make that phone call overnight either. He built that too, quietly, through choices nobody was watching. Choosing to stay late. Choosing to look carefully at numbers that were technically someone else's problem. Choosing, when it mattered, to pick up the phone instead of going home. Those are not dramatic gestures. They are the accumulation of a certain kind of character, repeated until it becomes instinct. That's what I want to say to anyone who has sat with a story like mine and wondered what the lesson is. It's not a warning, exactly. It's more of an observation about the long game that integrity plays. Noel's honesty cost him something, a reprimand, a mark on his file, an uncomfortable conversation with his manager. In the short term, doing the right thing made his life harder, and he did it anyway, because the alternative, going home knowing what he knew, was something he apparently couldn't live with. That's not a small thing. That is, I'd argue, the whole thing. I think about my grandchildren, too. They're 9 and 12, and none of what happened was their doing. They are going to grow up knowing something complicated about their father, and they're going to have to decide what to do with that knowledge. I hope they choose to understand it rather than repeat it. I hope they find, somewhere along the way, the kind of clarity that Noel has, the quiet, unspectacular clarity of a person who knows what they're willing to do and what they aren't. For myself, I'm still walking the river path every morning, still watching my step on the ice near the Carlton footbridge. Still drinking too much tea, and doing crossword puzzles at hours when I should probably be asleep. I'm not the same man I was before that phone call. But I'm not a diminished one either. If anything, I understand more clearly now what I value and who earned it. The 2 letters from my son sit in the drawer in my desk. I haven't answered them. I don't know if I will. But I read them both carefully more than once, and I think that counts for something. You don't have to forgive on anyone else's timeline. You don't have to perform reconciliation before you've actually arrived at it. What you do have to do, what I believe we all have to do, if we want to live with ourselves, is stay honest about where you actually are. I'm working on it. That's all I can tell you. I'm working on it.